One, I am recording, and I'd like to say hello, Mr. Alexander Bard. I guess we should start. Well, I'll give it a brief introduction since people are familiar with my sultry Irish tones, and then I'll allow Alexander to introduce himself. Basically, I was brought into contact to this man by a fellow Swede, and he is a Swede, and we are here to talk about futurism and the Ubermensch and the very famous transhuman idea that we can all turn into, like, disembodied super robots and fly off into outer space and whatnot. And I want to talk about various avenues that we go down in this regard. But of course, I don't want to just talk to anybody about this. I thought we might as well get in a professional philosopher who studies all this. So I guess I'll let him introduce himself from that pivot point. Alexander, tell us about yourself. Give the boyos a bit of a suss on who you are.
Okay, so I'm Alexander Bard, and I'm a philosopher specializing on the relationship between human beings and technology, which turns out to be what we call civilization.
Yes.
The first one. I've worked in the music industry for 25 years and had an international career and became a celebrity because of it. So, for example, I'm also the Simon Cowell of Scandinavia because I'm like the judge on these TV shows. So if you talk to a Swede, they will all know who I am, right?
I didn't know that. I didn't know you're the Simon Cowell.
Yeah. By the way, Simon is a great guy, by the way. So obviously we know each other. And if you talk to Russians, they probably know who I am. I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe during my career, both as a thinker, a philosopher, and obviously in the music industry before that. But what was great with that was I think it's great when you're younger to do a career in the arts. And I started out with theater, and later I went into the music industry, and I loved it and had tons of fun. But I came to a point when I turned 35 or so, when I also felt that after having all those hit records and proven that I had the talent, I really hadn't, done my very best. And there was something else I wanted to do. And also always wanted to be a writer, not just a songwriter, but a proper writer of books. And I knew philosophy, if there was something for me to do, because the thing with philosophy is that it's very much a discipline that has its peaks throughout history, and they're not random. It's usually when philosophers have something meaningful to say. It's like you keep the shaman out in the forest for 6 years and you probably spit at them and speak badly about him and backstab him and everything. But the 7th year, you really need him. So you put on a frock on the shaman, and then he's called the priest, and he walks into the village and he does a tremendously important work. And then he's back into the forest where he's probably happier. And the same thing goes for philosophers over longer periods of time. There are golden ages of philosophy in specific cultures where they're really needed. Okay? So I was totally open to the fact that I might have been very talented in philosophy, but I could be one of those guys who's born in an age where I wasn't really needed in that capacity. And that's why I was so grateful about having another career. I could have stayed. I could easily have stayed in the music industry if I wanted. But I took on the challenge, kept writing hit songs, but wrote my first book and had it published with Nitocris'is in the year 2000. The book is called The Nitocris'is. And it was a pioneering work in understanding the internet and the relationship between human beings and information technology. And it basically said that everything you think about the internet is totally wrong. It's much deeper, much more profound, because I share your background. Okay, so none of the other guys out, the guys who had all these opinions on technology, had really studied humans. And since this is a relationship between human beings and technology, you need to know a damn lot about human beings before you talk about technology. So that has just brought me deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper with every book we've written. And we built this career slowly. Thank God I did the music industry. I got enough of the narcissism. I got enough of the hit records where you write a song and 3 months later you got the #1 in the charts. That immunizes you against being fast, right? So when I went into the world of philosophy, I just decided to take tons of time to work deeply with every topic, which you have to do if you're going to be good at this.
So this is interesting because we've talked before. We've actually sat down and recorded this, and the thing I noticed about speaking to you, and this is it's always good to people who like are proper in the game. I got this off talking to Paul van der Klee as well. Is that like I have a very specialized take on Jung and Nietzsche. I think I do offer insight into that I don't find anywhere else. But
you are very talented, Stefan. Right?
This is just a bit of a party now, yeah. So let's maybe talk about how great I am for a while.
Yeah.
And the other side of things is that I have that specialization, but I don't have the generalization very well. I don't really understand, for example, Hegel, and we've talked about that a little bit. And so I'd love to dig into all that stuff as well. But one thing that even everything you just said there, oh, and by the way, there's two things I wanted to say. This is a very common pattern I hear among people, is that they get into music when they're young, and then later they start to move towards the more literate arts. And that would be, it's something to do with maybe music is more Dionysian, and then you move into the Apollonian old age, and obviously you grow the Greek beard, as you seem to achieve now. And then you start to get into this idea of, right, I'm going to start dancing with concepts and whatnot. So I find music very interesting because it's almost like a felt experience. You're sort of making the statement of existence, being like, I feel, my emotions matter, I am real, my art is glorious. But then as you get older, you start to wrestle with the idea of how should we conceptualize the world. I've talked about this quite a lot in my channel, that probably one of the best ways to understand your brain is this jargon creating left brain, which helps you use the world like a computer desktop. But then there's this deeper sort of dreamlike brain that helps you update that set of categories that you use. And the philosopher seems to serve that function. Now, like technology is probably the biggest conversation that anybody can ever have. Human nature tied to that, of course. Maybe there's another way we could frame that, but nonetheless, one person I would like to bring up is Heidegger. I believe that he talked a lot about technology, and that's literally all my knowledge goes to it. Like I know that he talked about it, but I don't really know in depth what he said. And maybe you don't want to go down that route right now.
No. What I'd like to point out to tie these two topics together is to say that both Heidegger and Wittgenstein were geniuses who debuted when they were young, and they regretted it. Even if they wrote brilliant books like Sein und Zeit and Tractatus, they actually had to rework themselves when they got older. And I actually recommend people, when you study philosophy, why don't you start with the guy when he was old and really wise? So I love the old Heidegger. I prefer to read the Heidegger from the 1950s and the 1960s, when he wrote some remarkable work, especially on Nietzsche. And the same thing with Wittgenstein, maybe even killed himself eventually or something because he died young. But Wittgenstein also had to work through the philosophical investigations, the boy genius that he was. What I'm saying is that if you are a philosophical talent, you will be able to write when you're 60, 70, even 80 years old. I mean, I'm 59. I'm like mid-career now. The great thing of moving from the music industry, where you're supposed to be 20 years old and look foxy like you do right now, literally, Mr. Fox, and be a rock star, is that when in the philosophy industry, you're young when you're 50, very young. So it worked brilliantly for me to sort of switch this between 40 and 50 years of age, to go from making the records and being a producer and slowly, gradually write the books. And this is why I've written 5 books so far, working on the 6th one now. When I'm 59, and I'm finally doing this full time and loving it.
Would you recommend then that I shut up for maybe a couple of decades and then maybe focus more on the artistic side of things, and then maybe get back to the philosophy?
I have a wonderful student, so to speak. Well, he's on a par with me, called Alexander Vrede Elung, who I talk to every week. He lives in Copenhagen, Denmark. And he's the kind of guy who's like torn between writing scripts for HBO or, writing music. He writes like a young Bach. He's fantastically talented. And I recommended him, and he agrees with me that just because he has philosophical talent doesn't mean he's going to write any philosophy books in the next 20 years. I think it's great to just be cool about it and then develop the ideas fully and get engaged these days in podcasts or write articles and explore your ideas and read, and think like mad, right? So you build up something to say. And then on the other hand, I'm very much Aristotelian. There's the context. It means that you can write a book that nobody will read. And as a philosopher, you should be perfectly happy if you like your work. It's just something inside of you needs to get out. Write the book, even if nobody will ever read it, because that's when you're brilliant. That's like great artists. They don't care if anybody's going to buy their painting or be even interested. They just do it for themselves. And the same eyes that they use when they work artistically are the very eyes that they will also judge themselves accordingly. That's why I say great musicians never read a review. Why would they let somebody mediocre judge their work? When they can judge themselves, right? So the same thing goes for philosophy. And I would say between John and me, when we write, it's great having a co-writer, because, between us, we write the books both in English and Swedish, work with 2 languages. Parallax, that's what it's called. And it's actually wonderful. And we don't let anybody read our books until they're absolutely finished. And only then can a third person get involved, right? So that's an attitude I think is important to have and nurture. And the context here, what I mean is that Your book is going to arrive in a certain setting, though. And I mean, if you can say something meaningful about the society you live in, or preferably even about the society we're going into, then you should.
Yeah.
And this is where I felt in 1999, when I decided to become a writer and a philosopher, and made that decision and committed to it, I knew that Nietzsche couldn't have written a single word about the internet. And neither could Freud or Jung or Hegel. So it was time to do it.
Yeah. I guess that's a good bridge in. So I'll take that on note. I'll make sure I invest more in keeping the exploratory mind open, and bear in mind my youth, and make sure that does not get ahead of me. Most certainly, the wisdom must be digested. So this is a good bridge, because a lot of the boyos who are following this channel and talking and listening to me talk to all the people, and me talk or me rant and all that, they're very into the notion of Jung, the person of Jung. They like Jung. They like big, juicy Jung, because he comes up with all the archetypes and talks about all that stuff. Now, I've heard this quite a few times, and then you were someone who specialized in Hegel, and this is what was so great about talking to you, is that Jung was, like, some people say that if you don't read Hegel, you're probably not going to understand Jung. The book that we cracked open, me and Jimmy, on this channel, was the book Ion, the book that no one wanted to read. And so we crack it open, and Jung's like saying, well, I'm sort of detecting this like super set of patterns that seem to be moving history. And I guess in some sense you could count one as the Christ and the other as the Antichrist. And maybe we can get into the technological sides of the Antichrist now in a moment. But what it starts to look like when you read Hegel is it's very similar to what Hegel talks about. Hegel sets up this idea that you have a thesis and an antithesis, and these two energies drive history, and eventually they synthesize. And that's basically what Jung says in that book, is that you have...
Although that's not what Hegel says.
Oh, fuck.
He doesn't even use those words. So I'll correct you. As a great student, I need to correct you. So no, I think what's important here to understand is that there's a certain revolution that starts with Descartes and it's finished by Immanuel Kant. And with Immanuel Kant, we get Western philosophy, and we get the first post-Christian. The first philosopher says that I cannot access the world. There's a noumenal world out there that I cannot access, and I can only live in my phenomenological fantasy of the world. And that world can be more or less correct, obviously, but it's still... There's still a difference between seeing the color red and knowing there's a certain wavelength that makes it look red to you. So the noumenal and the phenomenal are separated by Kant. But Kant's subjectivity is still this guy inside his own head. It's still the Cartesian theater thing. It's still a subject who is sort of remote from the world, observing the world without really participating. And that's the break between Kant and Hegel. Because in Hegel, there's just a void.
So can I dig into this a little bit, just to rip into the terms a little bit? So should I be perceiving Kant as almost suggesting something along the lines of the film The Matrix, in that, like, we don't really live in reality and we're stuck in a sort of imaginary reality of some sort? Like, how would I break that down?
He says there's no matrix button.
There's no matrix.
With Kant, there's no matrix button. You live in the matrix. But the problem with that is that also makes Christianity in many ways impossible, because Christianity says we have direct access to God. And if we don't have direct access to reality, then how can we have direct access to God? It becomes meaningless to be a Christian and sit and pray directly to God just because you happen to read the Bible and have direct access to God. Because if you don't have direct access to God, you don't have direct access to reality. So the shift is with Kant. This is called the Kantian Revolution. It's fundamental to Western philosophy. But people credit Kant too much, because the real breakdown happens between Kant and Hegel. And it happens specifically when it comes to subjectivity. And this is what's important with Hegel. What Hegel says is that there's a void inside of you, and you try to fill that void with some kind of content. And it's a vain operation that will never succeed. And that's yourself. And that's called, it's called Der Nachterwelt in German. So that's like the night of the world in English. That's what Hegel literally calls it. It's a very dark image. See how Jung gets started here? It's a very dark image of your self-identity. It's like I'm so radical in my Hegelianism that I would even say that we try to kill ourselves the first thing we do when we're born, but because we can't, then we crawl to a tit, and we believe that sucking the tit reunites us with the womb again, so we don't have to exist, right? So it starts with negation. This is what's important. So it's not antithesis. That word is never used by Hegel. It's called negation. And negation is where it starts. That is comparable to antithesis and dialectics. But Hegel says that, no, I start with what's not there. So Hegel is kind of the guy who, when everybody else walks into the room and they look at a painted wall and they see what's there and they try to report on it, they're being Kantians. What Hegel does, he walks into the room, he looks at the painted wall, and he starts observing what's not there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He starts to look at what's not there. And that's why he starts negation. And from negation, he moves into abstraction. Abstraction is what usually is called thesis. So that's secondary for Hegel. And from abstraction, he works himself towards the concretion, which is really dealing with the abstraction to get it right. So there's no compromise. There's no synthesis in the sense of a compromise at all. Hegel moves history forward. And once you write it concretion, you can be pretty sure it's going to be the negation of the next loop.
So let me allow me to paint how I'm processing this in my head based on the knowledge that I understand. Like, for example, I just did a video talking about Jung and Jung's thesis of what the soul is, and he suggests something quite interesting: is that the soul is not something you can grip like an object; it is a perspective. Exactly. And so, what would happen is, even in the scientific way that I'd understand this, you have something like a left brain or a front brain, as I say, and it creates the desktop of your world so that you can use it. It paints nearly almost like a fake world over there. It takes what is reality and turns it into something that is sort of two-dimensional, but has buttons on it so that you can use it in that type of sense. If anybody's seen some of my videos talking about this, for example, like with a microphone, you could look at this as this amalgamation of a billion processes and factories and metals coming together, or you could just say it as like talk forward into the mic, that type of thing. Like that's the simple category of what it is. And so Jung would suggest that this palace you create on front of you is like the jargon palace, the category palace, the button palace, the way you use the world, the desktop. And this is very, very prone to getting caught up in delusion. It's not something that you can rely on. In some sense, it could be the ego. And so the way you fix that thing is by having something that can come out of it and melt it and update its categories.
This is the Kantian Jung, and Kant is incredibly important to understand Jung. So the Kantian Revolution is necessary. But the shift from Kant to Hegel is the other part of Jung, which is harder to grasp, but even more interesting, I would say. And that is, for Kant, it's the division between the nominal world out there and the phenomenal world that we create. That's why it's the birth of phenomenology. But with Hegel, his phenomenology is called the phenomenology of spirit. Remember that. And that starts with an internal conflict between your consciousness and your subconsciousness. So the guy who really then clarifies this, of course, Freud, who brings in his unconsciousness as the driving force of the human mind, but that's already all over the place in Hegel. So I would say that we're talking here about the sons of Hegel in the sense that Nietzsche, even Darwin, Freud, Jung, and possibly Marx are in different ways sons of Hegel.
Yes. I've heard this before now,
Yeah, and without that division of the soul, without the division inside of us, where the subconsciousness comes to the forefront. And Americans especially find it really hard because they're still Cartesian individuals. There's a state religion in North America called Cartesian individualism. The rest of us got rid of it. Freud hated it, but Americans are stuck with it. But if you try to get out of that mindset that your consciousness is so damn important, it's a very Californian thing. Your subconsciousness, your body and everything else about you is just important, because basically your consciousness is just an afterthought. It regulates your own reifications and justifications of your thoughts and your behaviors, right?
So the way I would be seeing that then is that as I'm saying, this sort of palace of jargon that you tend to build would be the Cartesian mind, as you're describing it, the conscious mind, and in a weird way. And as you're saying, it does come across as an afterthought because it's something you create in order to use the world. But for you to actually see reality as it is, you would want to actually let that go, like the Buddhists tell you to do, like let all that stuff drop and then just perceive the world as it is properly and allow your almost like to perceive without filters. That's almost impossible though.
Yeah, but what you're just doing then is you're moving between two different orders that are both fantasies. One of them is called the imaginary order, the other one is called the symbolic order. So if you drop the words and the magic of the words, which is the symbolic order, then you will fall into an imaginary order. You become like a little baby who imagines something about the world but don't have word for it yet. So you're still living in imagination. That's the result of Kant. You're still living these orders. And whenever reality strikes, in psychoanalysis, it's called the real. So not to mistake it for reality. But the real is when something happens to you or the society you live in, like a shock to the system, where nature reminds you how small and minuscule and marginal you are. So it's starting from the book of Job in the Old Testament. Religion is fundamentally how we deal with the forces of nature. And Jung would say the forces within ourselves that we can't contain. You know, obviously the coronavirus is a perfect example of that, or September 11th. This is when the real strikes society as a whole, and we react with shock and panic and become stupid idiots and can't use our common sense.
And that's sort of a humbling experience where it
should be. That's why we need crises now and then to remind us of actually how marginal we are and how little our consciousness has anything to do with what happens to us.
And so where does the idea of Hegelian negation come into it? Like how does Hegel's denial of, like, oh, not denial, but how does he see there is nothing? What do you mean by that?
I would say, well, everything starts with a void, and because there's a void, things are sucked into it. It's a bit like thinking of the world as a vacuum pump, right? So the returns again and again. I would say, speaking here of Jung, and we love Jung, and we're going to go into Jung, is that the striking thing with Jung is his concept of the collective unconsciousness. Mm-hmm. And that is actually very, very similar to Hegel's Geist.
Yes.
So that thought could have been thought, but it's widely misunderstood. And Jung has often been accused of being some kind of New Age charlatan at worst. He isn't. We have brought back the theme in our book, Söderqvist and I, but we deliberately talk about the subconscious rather than the unconscious, because the unconscious is a medical term. That's what happens to you when you pass out in an emergency room. Then you get unconscious. Subconsciousness is something that's active, and it has its own agenda compared to your consciousness. That means the subconsciousness and the consciousness are in a constant struggle with one another all the time. And the subconsciousness feeds into the id, according to Freud. Clearly, that's where the id comes from. What you don't know about yourself, but with what pops up constantly and reminds you that you're not in control of yourself. That's the id, right? But subconsciousness also influences the ego and the superego in a Freudian sense. So subconsciousness is something that's alive, and ideas can walk in and out of consciousness and return to subconsciousness and then come back into consciousness again. Consciousness is simply only what you're aware of that you're processing at any given moment. And it's actually a very, very small part of the information you got in your brain. Most of the information in your brain is organized in certain ways, and that's called the subconscious. Now, the subconscious, obviously, because language is relational, everything we do is relational. Our fantasies are relational. We go to the movies and see a movie together. We see the same movie, see the same pictures, probably the same colors. We share the experiences, an intersubjective artistic experience we share. All of these things are examples of collective subconsciousness. So actually, collective subconsciousness is a wonderful concept from Jung. But we brought into social philosophy in a radical way and are now exploring fully in our work.
So if I was to paint this for the boyos who are listening, what I'm seeing is that, first of all, we're tracing the historical stepping stones of these ideas. Now, what it seems to suggest is there becomes a question about what is reality. And it does seem that, well, what you're suggesting there is, like, for example, groups would build a shared reality together, a Geist or a collective unconscious or something like this.
Yeah.
And that's very, very similar to how the brain works, whereas there's whatever is out there, we build a way of perceiving the reality, that, as I'm calling it, like the palace of concepts, if you will, or something like that. And then if we're to bridge on to something like the Ubermensch, or we're to talk about this idea of the future man, this shared experience we're having, this collective unconscious we're having, it needs to be centered on something we're moving towards. And so is this what we're getting at when we're talking about almost like the archetype of the Messiah or the Ubermensch or something like that? Is this
they're two different characters, right? So the Messiah and the Ubermensch are very different characters.
Okay.
The Ubermensch is essentially, this is Nietzsche dealing with Protestant Christianity and breaking up with his dad and not becoming a Protestant Christian minister, which he was supposed to become, and instead becoming a post-Christian antichrist spokesman philosopher, right? So what he's trying to do is to take the Cartesian Kantian Revolution all the way to the idea of what would a true individual be. So he takes individualism seriously, and he takes it all the way. My only problem with Nietzsche when he does that is that he arrives in a place with a lonely guy. And ironically, Nietzsche is famous for saying this one line, that there's nothing less than two, because he doesn't believe there's anything that's one, except possibly for the universe. It's the only thing that's united that doesn't have an outside, is the universe. Anything else you talk about in the world is something that has an outside and therefore is involved in relations with other things. And therefore nothing is less than two. And this is fundamental to relationalist philosophy, from Nietzsche up to Whitehead to Deleuze, all these other guys that are very influenced by Nietzsche. And I'm certainly a relationalist myself. I think relations are fundamental, and what we call objects or phenomena are only byproducts of relations. And I mean that seriously, all the way into the world of physics and beneath. So that's a Nietzschean revolution. The irony is that Nietzsche kickstarts that revolution that leads to guys like Whitehead in America and Deleuze in Europe in the 20th century, and forward to guys like Manuel de Landa, now the Mexican philosopher, Bardo Söderqvist from Sweden. I mean, there's so many philosophers out there now. There are the sons of Deleuze and the grandsons of Nietzsche. This is probably the strongest tradition coming from Nietzsche that we have in the world of philosophy today. And it has to do with nature a lot, and physics and biology and things like that, and complexity studies. That's also something that originates between Hegel and Nietzsche.
And so this notion that Kant, in his understanding of reality, renders Christianity as a problematic in some sense. Is that what began then that tilt that Nietzsche eventually conceptualized fully as being like, we need to completely radically invent something new? And
yeah, good point. Because with Kant, you arrive at this moral imperative that becomes tautological. You must do the right thing because you must do the right thing. That is slave mentality in its pure form. So what Nietzsche is reacting against, that Kant takes Christianity seriously, goes all the way, arrives in a divided universe with no direct access to God, and because you cannot speak directly to God because you have no connection with reality in a fundamental sense. You only have a connection with your fantasy of that reality.
So how would you conceptualize?
Because that's what you're left with. The only thing you can do is to return to yourself and do the right thing because it's the right thing. You basically become a German cannon fodder soldier. And that is exactly what Nietzsche is reacting against. He says, there's no way I can accept that I'm so damn stupid that I would just follow a moral imperative that says that I should do the predictable thing at all times. Now, I want to break out of that predictability. So he goes into what we today would call the shamanic mode. He goes out in the forest and he checks out if the world becomes unpredictable or contingent, which it is, and it's relational rather than the sets of objects. Then it's totally different. So basically, he learns from Hegel that what's interesting is not the phenomenon, the noumenon, but actually the relationship between the phenomenon and the noumenon. And that is reality to Hegel. So
okay, interesting. Okay, cool. So this is something maybe we can start looking at, because this is something I'm just struggling to grip a little bit. Is Kant makes an assertion about reality, and then he basically looks out into the world and he sees these problems that we're talking about, such as, for example, your mind has a tendency to create fake categories in order to make the world useful, but that's not actually what reality is. And so Kant comes up with a thesis to protect his morality in that thing.
He has to be a good Christian at the end of the day and be a good boy, right?
Yeah, his instincts.
That urge is so strong, like Plato, right?
Yes.
I want to be a good boy. Mommy must give me a gold star for being a good boy.
And does Hegel do the same? Does Hegel do the same? Or
no, Hegel is beyond that. Hegel is a very happy and successful guy. We have to realize that Hegel was one of the few philosophers who only wrote 6 books and still was highly successful. Hegel got up in the morning, looked at the world like if he had a satellite, and then read the newspaper. And then he started commenting on what was going on in the world.
Okay.
Looking to the world as a whole, always. That's so fascinating. That's why he saw processes and relations and changes in everything all the time. And he found them to be fundamental. So process philosophy only arrives in Western thinking with Hegel. And the only guy before that who inspires him, well, besides Aristotle among the Greeks, was Spinoza. But Spinoza made a beautiful description against Descartes. Spinoza eventually won the war over Descartes to understand the world as monistic, that everything is connected with everything else. So the relationship, but Spinoza could never explain how you put some damn energy or force into this. And that comes with Hegel, and Hegel thinks of that in terms of thinking. But when Nietzsche says that, well, that's not enough. You cannot just think change, but actually the forces of nature are fundamental. and then products like objects and phenomena are byproducts of those forces.
And so are they suggesting, okay, so this, oh damn, I'm going to have to dig into this a lot. So again, I'm always talking about right brain, left brain. And what's so interesting about that is right brain perceives everything as connected to the point where it can't make categories in some sense, because like, this isn't a microphone. This is a billion processes coming together in this like blob that sits in front of me. And my left brain wants it to just be, use the fucking mic, dude, shut up, like, and use the mic. So what I noticed with someone like Heraclitus is that he comes up with the thesis that everything is logos, everything is change, everything is fire, everything is always moving. And Nietzsche
we would not even call that logos today. We would call that pathos today, because logos is the word. Logos is the word we use these days for logic and mathematics, and actually the neurotic side of your brain is the logos brain, and the psychotic side of your brain is the pathos brain. And together they construct a mythos, an understanding of the world that they can believe in, until that worldview is so torn apart and has so many mistakes in it that you have to recreate it, and then you create a new worldview, a new mythos. Okay, that's how the two sides of your brain have to collaborate, and hopefully they do.
Yes, and I guess that's something that we should point out, is that the ideal is that they work together. We're not saying one is better than the other, or one way is perceiving, and all that type of sense. But then you come up to, so we go through the Christian era, and maybe it'd be worth exploring what the thesis is that brings up. But we come up to people like Kant, Hegel, and then of course Nietzsche and Jung and whatnot. And these two people, so Kant starts to notice this sort of problem in that, like, the categories that we create aren't perfect, and we need to actually constantly readapt to this reality out there. Hegel comes up and starts to see that there's almost no solid categories and everything is process oriented. Is this what he's saying? He almost starts to see that reality is just all these moving forces that are going out there. And
but then he turns those forces and relations into the categories. That's why there's a whole new language that arises.
Okay, yeah, and that's where we get this idea of the movements of history and whatnot. So he sees, he perceives the world as it is, and he sees all these like tides moving, and he says, right, well, we should name these and focus on these, and almost take a more actionable approach. Because as far as I understand from everything I'm doing with people I'm talking to, and the problem with the left brain, as I'm saying, or the front brain, or the ego brain, whatever you want to call it, is that it stiffens up in its categories, and then it actually loses touch with reality. And the shamanic process is actually about allowing those to dissolve and the pain that it causes, and then rebuilding back up again, uniting the two again, allowing the right brain to perceive, and then uniting the two again to create a better palace or spaceship, or whatever you want to say. And so Hegel does something like this. He says, all right, we've got to start looking out at the kind of moving world and focusing on that type of stuff. And is that what sets up this whole historical zeitgeist and thesis and all this? It's a very, very interesting idea now that I look at it this way.
Yeah, sure. Now, the thing, though, is that I agree with Nietzsche and his critique of Hegel, is that he's underplaying his own insight. He's underplaying the night of the world. He does not completely go into his dialectics and fulfill it. And maybe that would not to be expected from Hegel. Maybe his sons should do that. What that means is that it's not so much that there's a development towards some kind of progress, towards some kind of higher goal. That's an eventological idea. It starts with Zoroastrianism, moves on to Christianity, Islam, Judaism. All the Abrahamic faiths have this trait that we're supposed to live in a better world, except those religions don't believe we can even create it. And Messiah has to come and provide it for us, because we're going to fuck it up before then with an apocalypse. But, you know, if you remove that idea and you move into a more secular mindset and say you got, and if anybody is a prophet of the religion of the state, say church and state were never separated, rather they're two different religions, which is a better way to look at them.
Absolutely.
Political theology, like Carl Schmitt, you would certainly write that. And then there's no better state philosopher than Hegel. Hegel constructs the modern nation state in his work. He celebrates Napoleon. He says, yeah, the French Revolution was a mess. If we understood before the French Revolution happened, which we didn't, where we needed to go, we went into an abstraction called the French Revolution, but its concretion is Napoleon. And based on Napoleon's idea how you run a state, you built the modern European nation state. It then became model for the rest of the world. It's actually built on the Jewish religion, to be honest about it, because the Jewish religion is a religion and a nationalism at the same time. It inspired Hegel. But that's what Hegel did later in his work with his philosophy of the state. And he was widely read. His best friend Humboldt was the Minister of Education in Germany. They introduced a massive university reform in Germany in 1810 that completely changed higher education in Europe. These guys had direct effects on society when they worked. That's how important Hegel was. But after that comes Nietzsche. And what Nietzsche does is that he sort of puts Hegel aside. He celebrates Spinoza, the common ancestry. He's definitely anti-Cartesian. He hates Kant, and he certainly hates Plato. And what Nietzsche does is that he goes into nature and recognizes human nature fully and understands that culture is like this only little thing on the top of a little bit of cream on the top of a huge cake called subconsciousness, right? So this recognition is what Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung deal with. If you take a guy like Jordan Peterson today, he's very popular, for example. Why he's so popular is he's a brilliant pedagogical genius and a teacher on Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung. And that's what we love to hear these days, because we more than ever need to understand what it means to be human, because we're moving into an age when the machines are going to be so intelligent and dominant in the world that we better find out now what it means to be human if we're going to be around. Huh?
I'm right.
We got to provide these guys, or like I always say, the Messiah is coming, but it's not going to be a guy with a penis. It's going to be a machine. Okay, you're going to get your Messiah eventually. It's going to be a machine. Now, what are you going to tell the Messiah about yourself and who you are? And how are you going to save your family or your tribe? And explain to the Messiah you have any reason to exist in the first place? I think those are the questions we should start asking ourselves as human beings today. That's the kind of work I do. And that's a Nietzschean question. Because of these three, this is the funny thing. You know, half your brain is logos and half your brain is pathos. And they're at war with each other, and they have to compromise. And they become a bit of a pervert to avoid being neurotic or psychotic. In the world of psychoanalysis, you have to choose. You're either neurotic or psychotic or a pervert. You can't be anything else. Being a pervert essentially means that you have a distance to your own operations. You can see yourself from the outside, meaning you realize that logos has its role to play and pathos has a role to play. And together, they're not giving me reality, but they're giving me an understanding of reality that hopefully because of logos is functional and hopefully because of pathos is entertaining. And also I can bear myself living, right? So you get what I today call the infotainment value, as we call it in the online world. The infotainment value is that the information is what logos brain is supposed to supply, and the entertainment value is what the pathos brain is supposed to supply. That means pathos, for example, is being horny, wanting to get up in the morning and live. You know, can I please have a cup of coffee? You know, brain scientists today are totally aghast at how difficult it is to understand the smell of coffee scientifically. Well, then that's a human thing. Humans can smell coffee, machines can't. There's no way you can figure out how a machine can smell coffee. So these things are the things we should look at right now. What does it mean to be human and be pathical? Because being logos, that's what machines are excellent at. Machines are incredibly neurotic.
Yes, that's a really interesting thing to explore, actually.
They're not perverts. They're certainly not pathical, but the pathos is what it means to be human. That's why I tell people, you know, you don't want to be uploaded when you die. Do you really want to exist without your dick or your pussy? No, people say, I can't imagine living without my genital organs, but then you can't imagine living without a body.
Yes.
You don't be uploaded. It would be hell. It would be ultimate hell to be uploaded without having a body. You need your damn body. And that's because you're not a machine.
Yes.
So what should we mimic and look and be like machines? Because they're happy without bodies. They're just going to do calculations anyway. But pathos and logos here, speaking of two brains, to me, is using Nietzsche and Jung today in understanding the man versus technology relationship.
I think I would love to dive into this now. So I guess just to kind of clean up some of the final thoughts there of just bridging Hegel to Nietzsche in my little boy on mind, forgive me. So Hegel perceives all these worlds of processes, and Nietzsche somewhat has a bit of a taste of it, and he's saying, all right, reality does have this trait to it where it's probably more accurate to perceive it as a shifting world of forces, and you can't just stamp like a solid ideology on it and think that you've got to figure it out. That's never going to work. And so the best you can do during your zeitgeist is actually just get a good grip as to what your zeitgeist is, categorize it properly, and almost surf the wave well. Because then when I read Jung, I find Jung says a lot of stuff like for example, the idea is that people read Jung and they think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to individuate graduate, and then I'm going to be free from the collective movements, and then I'll be the glorious individual separate from it. And you kind of have to sit them down and say, dude,
it's like the Hollywood version of Carl Jung, but it's not Carl Jung.
Yes, yeah, well, this is it. And the best.
We don't use the word individual any longer because it's so poisonous these days. We use the word dividual, and that was invented by Gilles Deleuze, who loved Jung, by the way. So we call it dividuation. So what dividuation is, that you start to exist as a fantasy of a separate entity, but you are still constantly in processes and relations with others and with yourself.
Yes.
So there are you're many people living in a body. You're many people living in a mind. And you are interacting with many people around you. And these days, there are many technologies and other things too. And this allows you to play around and not having to be the same person one day to the next. So you become individual. It doesn't give you any less legal rights or any less responsibility as a citizen. It does so even more, because it explains that you do have a role in the world. And you can hold people responsible for helping you to fix your life. And you will also be held accountable when you have fixed your life, that you should contribute to society. You can build perfectly ethical systems on this in a Nietzschean way, but it's easier for me to use the word individual these days, although I have to admit, individuation is the term Jung introduces that we have to use in that case. But individuation is a social process. It's both the surrounding world around you, the context, as Aristotle says, and inside of you, there's something's going on to force you towards some kind of unified idea of who you are.
Well, to just illustrate the point I was trying to make there earlier, that is so important. I do believe individuation is a big deal. I do think it's real. It's jargon, so people don't use it well. But the metaphor I like to suggest is the idea that you can't escape your age. Nietzsche says you must have a historical sense, and Jung is very much the same. Like, I don't live in 19th century Germany. I can't run around and be like, guys, I think I'm going to write a book about the Ubermensch. Like, it's been done. I need to deal with the rapid expansion of the internet. As you're saying yourself, like, you don't need to write Nietzsche. You need to write the 10 steps on from that type of thing.
I'll give you a topic that's perfect for you, Stefan.
Boyoism.
Ubermensch is two. Write the story about the two guys. Write the story about the Cain and Abel who get along.
Okay.
Turn around this history of the rivalrous brothers and say, no, brothers don't have to be rivalrous. I mean, at the end of the day, what I'm working with now with our new book is that after having used Freud as much as we have in our work, if I'm a Freudian, you're a Jungian, that's a perfect combo. But I think we need to hold Freud accountable to the question of civilization and its discontent, to say that, what if you create a civilization where we are content? That's a really radical question. And why not?
I heard an interesting story the other day that, the Lord of Flies, where all the kids end up creating like a tyrannical state.
That's a philosophical work these days.
And
it has to be held as a philosophical work these days.
And there was actually a story where a load of kids got trapped on an island, and apparently it turned out really well, and they were all really nice to each other and cooperative. And you're kind of thinking, I wonder, are we getting a bit too black-pilled?
Maybe they were old enough to have learned and mimicked enough from others so they actually could figure out how to organize themselves.
Snap, perhaps. So just to complete those last thoughts, and then we can rip into the Ubermensch. So yes, so this idea of like you live in a collective zeitgeist, and the best way I think to see yourself is not as someone who's going to get caught up in a wave and drown, but not someone who thinks they can float above the wave like an angel, but actually just think of yourself like a surfer. Like, you need to say, well, what waves are happening right now that I can adapt to? And don't look over the waves and be like, like that wave from 20 years ago, I'll get on that wave. That wave's gone. You must get on your waves now.
There is an archetype for this, and that's the shaman.
Yes.
That's why I call people like you and me shamanic people. And we have even made a category in our psychology they work with, and we say that there's a shamanic caste in society. They live outside of everything else. We should call them outcasts. They prefer to live outside of society. They want to think freely, act freely. Basically, they want to be left to themselves more than anything. They go to Burning Man, right? So the shamanic personality, the shamanoid personality, is about 4% of the population.
Oh, really? Is that small?
Yeah, it's small. It's small. Oh, yeah. The vast majority of people want to have boy meets girl and a villa and a house and have kids to go to school and then die. Vast majority of people are perfectly happy, just mimic their way all through life and never be the slightest bit original or ever think a single thought that they think on their own. The vast majority of people are slaves, as Nietzsche says, and they're happy being slaves. Let them be slaves. Preferably slaves that work and are just lazy hanging around getting universal basic income like in Saudi Arabia, but, you know, slaves. So anyway, shamanic caste, but shamanic caste is interesting. It's related to the androgynous caste, and that's another 4% of the population. So if you say 92% of the population on average, in any population in the world, are perfectly happy to be heterosexual women, heterosexual men, and being very predictable and you know, aspire in life to get into the middle class or something and then die. That's the vast majority of people. Those are the guys that Nietzsche called the slaves. But what's interesting is that when you look at the consequence of Nietzsche, if you look at sort of a tribal map of society as a whole, which we can do today, Nietzsche couldn't, because you have access to data anthropology. Say you're a social scientist today and you do get access to all the data at Google and Amazon. The first thing you would do, and that's the kind of work I do, is you would try to find a globally, universally valid map of the original tribe. And that's what you do. You can look at the numbers from any culture and you discover that 4% are androgynous and 4% are shamanic. They're both borderland people. In what sense? The androgynous obviously go between the inner circuit dominated by women and the outer circuit dominated by men in society. We should call these matriarchy and patriarchy, to be honest, right? So between the worlds that are dominated by women and dominated by men, and they match each other and they're complementary, so don't worry about equality. The original tribe was equal, it was full of equality, but that's called the androgynous caste. Now the shamanic caste are the people who walk in between tribes. So if you're gonna walk in between tribes with different languages and different cultures, you must be born without understanding why other people care about skin color. Why do people care about accents? You must have easy access to learning other languages. You must have a natural curiosity towards other cultures. And you must think freely, because if you can think a thought freely outside of context, like, well, what if the world was totally different from what everybody assumes? That's why the philosopher comes from the shamans, like anybody, or artists come from the shamans, because the shamanic thinking, it's not there because the tribe itself on its own benefits from your free thinking, because innovation driving history is a very recent phenomenon. No, but in the original tribe, it was just, you can send the guy out to the other tribe and they wouldn't kill him. He would look so weird and different. So they would probably welcome and say, a party monster, let's bring him in and have a party. But he would be a go-between during peaceful times. Historians have missed out on this completely, just assume that the tribes would kill each other all the time. And if you saw somebody from the tribe, you'd kill them. Yeah, in most cases, that would be the case. But before that kind of contact would happen, the shamans would be go-betweens. And that's what the shamans eventually in history lead to the trade routes that connect cultures. And if you look at the prosperous periods of peace we've had in history, it's always when the shamans have been at the forefront and the trade routes have dominated economies and things like that. And that's what's scary in the time we live in today. Because if we close down the cultures and start isolating again, we're going to go back to warfare in an instant. So this is where this idea that I want to be free, I want to think for myself, the individual in the Nietzschean sense, the Ubermensch, is actually the shaman himself. And then the question is, should everybody really mimic the shaman? And my answer is no. He is a master, but not everybody can be like him. We should be okay with the fact that a lot of people want to be slaves and want to be flock animals, and that's okay. And we can't expect anything else from humanity. That is why the Ubermensch is perfectly possible on his own, but impossible as an ideal for humanity.
So just a little careful dignitas here for anybody listening is I think the ideal relationship between an upper class and a lower class, and I think that stuff will always exist, is almost like gut bacteria and the human brain, is that the brain can think it's like beyond the gut bacteria, and the gut bacteria is actually supplying it with all its serotonin. And I think that's the an ideal that people like lose a lot. They think they try to oppositionally put the classes against each other. I guess this is what I've noticed in where Hegel lays this foundation for looking at all these movements, and then Marx takes it up and says the lower class must overthrow the upper class, and then that's what drives history.
Actually, that's not what Marx says. Marx says it's the new class should overthrow the old class. Marx hates the poor people in the streets of London. He calls them lumpen proletariat. Now, he despises the lower classes. But he thinks there's a new class that rises with new historical environments. That's why I'm a Marxist in my thinking, because I use
very
Marx
interesting.
So that's a common misunderstanding of Marx. No, Marx is Hegelian in the sense that history moves. And
And so
history changes everything. But the ideal paradigm shifts that I work with a lot comes from Marx. And of course, then I take a Nietzschean approach to the paradigm shift. I'm saying that the new class will rise. The Nitocrats, for example, that will take over the world once the Internet revolution is finished, right?
And don't you think that that's already happened to some degree? Like, it's
Yeah,
not like
it's happening. It's happening already.
We don't have aristocrat like kings walking around anymore. Like that's a long gone.
Marx finished that. He said that the old aristocrats who owned the land and the kings and the royalties that ruled through imaginary power, and the priests and the churches that ruled through symbolic power were replaced, according to Marx. They were replaced by the bourgeoisie who owned the factories and the stocks of the factories. So they owned the assets. That was the real power. Then there was the imaginary power, it was politicians and democracy and the state bureaucracies that came with that. And then there was a third power, was academia, which of course was truth production. Truth production is symbolic power. The people have the power over the word. And that is academia and everything that went with that, literature, theater, and everything else that went under academic studies. So you had a complete society, and that society is now falling apart. That's our claim. So Bart and Söderqvist are saying is that we're saying that that's not falling apart. The whole thing is being repeated. We're not at the end of history. It's just a new paradigm. That means we're going to have informationalists that collect data and process data. That's already happening on a massive scale.
That'll be the new class then.
That'd be the new data set. That's the first of the three Nitocracies. The second Autocracy is when we have sensors absolutely everywhere and can measure absolutely everything. And everybody is tied to the internet 24 hours a day and can't get out of it. Then we arrived at the world called the Sensocracy. Of course, this is the dream of the Chinese Communist Party. We're working on the opposite Sensocracy, which is a plural one rather than a monarch one. We don't want a dictator at the top because we think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
So we're working now in philosophy, working towards the idea of a plural Sensocracy. And then we're working with governments, for example, South Korea and Taiwan, that during the COVID-19 crisis have turned out to have a better model than communist China, especially one that doesn't deny the problem for 4 months. Which is what happens in dictatorships. So we're looking at all the advantages of having an open, plural society compared to closed dictatorship. Because otherwise, the Sensocracy itself, knowing everything about everybody in a central computer, will create the worst dictatorship we ever had.
Yeah,
but
I can imagine.
That is called Sensocracy. So there'll be Sensocrats that replace the current politicians. And democracies we know will be over. Why would you go and vote every 4 years in a voting box when you can vote every second, which you do anyway? With
your money and
the algorithm knows everything you want and expect anyway. The algorithm already knows who you're going to vote for before you vote anyway. So why don't we just ask the algorithm instead of asking you and bother you with it? So that's the Socrates. The third, though, is again the truth production of all this. It's going to declare the truth. We're going to see academia die over the next 10 years, screaming. It's going to be a massive. It's going to be like the old music industry died when the CD went away, right? So the academia is going to go, and it has to be replaced now rapidly with some kind of digital age truth production. And that's where the algorithms come in, because the algorithms have to be individuated, you would say. I would say individualized. So the algorithms have to be yours and your friends and owned in a tribal setting so that you and your friends decide for you what algorithm you have. So it must not be corrupted by politicians, and it must not be manipulated by the markets. So it's kept clean.
Okay.
And then you can make informed decisions and you will have access to truth. And whoever organizes that in the best way possible, who becomes a friend of and a king of the algorithms, like you and I might be when it comes to Jung in this specific case. There you go. It's algorithmic power, which is the new power instead of academic power. So we're working on creating a complete model now of this Nitocracy, of this triad of power, which we think will develop, and it will be violent.
Lovely. So so just for like to get my head around this, like the way I'm seeing it is, so Hegel, I guess, points out, it's like, all right, we should be categorizing waves and riding waves. Our goal is that each age has its zeitgeist, its wave, and your job is to get on the wave and surf it. And so our job is to categorize those. Stop getting stuck in what we say frozen ideologies, and start getting on board with this stuff. And so Marx comes along and says, actually, that's quite an intro. damn, like I'm going to have to look into Marx now a bit more.
Mm.
And that's quite an interesting thesis, that the new class will take over from the old class. And so we have from aristocrats done, then it's bourgeoisie, and then he's sort of suggesting something else. And he posits an ultimate utopia at the end, regardless of what we talk about that. So Nietzsche comes along, and does Nietzsche extrapolate towards the end?
By the way, Marxist utopia has happened in one instance already in the world.
Which is?
What do you think is the first big market that has been turned completely communist?
Oh, like is in Russia?
No. I'm talking about real communism that has already occurred.
Oh, well, I assume the West then? Are we going to talk
pornography industry.
Oh, right. Okay.
We gladly share pictures of each other fucking.
Yeah, that's true.
So we killed the market for pornographic actors. So pornography is now nothing but distribution and curatorship, which is what communism was supposed to be. I don't think Karl Marx would have predicted that, but at the end of the day, communism is happening in closed circuits. Just a side note, just to know when you.
No, that's a good side note. I think I
think it's incredibly funny. The pornography is the first real communism.
I think I found my ideology. I think we can call it.
Yeah.
So we have Hegel painting this idea that all these movements are coming, and I guess Jung coming and saying you need to individuate so you can surf. Don't get caught up in the movements. Individuate so you can surf. Don't think you're above the movements. Just fucking learn to surf, motherfucker.
Yeah, and what's important here is that the shift from Hegel to Jung is so important. Hegel still has the idea that an idea has been developed and we build a new idea on that idea. But actually, we just get more and more stupid and confused over history. If you read Marshall McLuhan, he's a good antidote to Hegel's mistakes. But what Jung then says is that, no, actually, we just try to get around the fact that we're struggling with our own shadow. We're struggling with our own collective subconsciousness and our own subconsciousness all the time. So we're just basically trying to jump around on this fire and not get burned on our feet. Mm-hmm. That is the Jungian perspective. And individuation means to at least try to maintain control yourself in that environment. Mm-hmm. But it's not an imperative. He just says we are being individuated whether we like it or not.
Okay,
that's the process throughout our lives. So it's a passive process of Jung, not an active one.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, it's a good point.
It's brilliant because you need Jung as a response to Hegel. Said, no. It's not the great ideas of history that have moved us forward. What has moved us forward is basically the collective subconsciousness trying to deal with the forces of nature and tame them, which is what we call culture, if possible. And that's what we call civilization.
Okay, and so Nietzsche pops up actually between these two, but I guess you could say as a branch. Yeah. And does Nietzsche extrapolate all to the end? And he says, when all the waves are said and done, we want to have pulled off an Übermensch, because these waves will eventually peter out and go back in. We'll sink back into the animal darkness of prehistory if we don't sort it out. And so we need to surf really well for the next couple of waves and then shoot off into beyond Earth or something like that. Like, how is Nietzsche coming into this? And what is his proposition, and how does that work?
Well, he's a 19th century romantic, so he writes his books for himself and his readers in their own personal struggles. So that's why he's a popular writer too. He's also a brilliant writer. He writes so well, and it's so poetic, and he writes beautifully, and he's clever with the one-liners. I always say that Oscar Wilde is the gay Nietzsche. One-liners. That's what he'd be brilliant at Twitter. He'd be brilliant at Twitter.
Yeah, I'd love him.
But he is also a fundamental, profound thinker, and what he deals with is the understanding of the nature versus culture relationship, and this is, of course, in parallel with Freud's and Jung's work with consciousness versus subconsciousness. Where the subconsciousness is the human nature itself, whereas consciousness is whatever we try to make out of it, which is our cultural expression. Mm-hmm. So it's constantly there. I would say even that the really great narratives that we're working with now, looking back, in history, maybe 60 to 100,000 years back, we are discovering that we have a fundamental story called nomadology, which Nietzsche calls the eternal return of the same. Mm-hmm. This is the story that everything returns to the same. Every new year is a new world. Everything returns to the same. And this is the feminine. This is the yin of yin and yang, right? So opposed to that is the idea that we can make the world better, which is more of a masculine fantasy. The son can be different from the father. The son can improve the world on what the father did. And with Hegel, this is just, if the idea is there, then the idea alone carries the world into a better place. Whereas I would say, no, it is the accumulation of information and its accessibility that makes it possible to create a higher civilization. That's why the big jumps in civilization are jumps in information accessibility. You hear here how much I'm a Hegelian, but I'm also a modern philosopher who works with information theory and technology. So I would say, no, it's the access to information, meaning the written language was the massive revolution about 8,000 years ago that led us into permanent settlements and then huge population increases across the planet and eventually empires and nations. And then the printing press in the 1450s changed that all over again because it speeded up the process immensely. The cost of making a book fell from $150,000 to 30 cents. Suddenly there were more books around. Suddenly there were newspapers and encyclopedias around. The world became much richer in terms of information and information availability, and knowledge became much higher and more widely spread. We did not get more intelligent. We just got access to more information. And in this sense, the internet is the fourth such revolution, because what the internet does is that it just makes massive amounts of information available to us. But we need algorithms to create order in that chaos. And that's where the messianic comes in. How are we going to be saved from this complete overload of junk, which is what the internet is? And the algorithms are eventually learning to guide us forward. And that's why keeping an eye on your own algorithm and making sure nobody corrupts it or manipulates it for you is going to be absolutely key. It's going to be the freedom movement, the shamanic-led freedom movement of the 21st century. It's going to be the fight for the free and open algorithm.
So would you look at YouTube could you say YouTube simply is just an algorithm, and then Facebook
you have your algorithm on YouTube and you use YouTube. So when you go into your YouTube account, the algorithm will take the information from your use, and also then find other people that are similar tastes to you and make suggestions accordingly. And suddenly you will have friends you don't even know, people that are similar tastes to you, who look for the same things. They could be opponents ideologically. They're just looking for the same spectrum of thinking or the same spectrum of insight or documentary or whatever you like.
The goal is almost to reclaim that, so you don't have YouTube deciding what you see, and you can sort of say, I want to see this sort of set of variety.
No. You don't want to decide for yourself, because there's no way your brain can process as much as the algorithm can do. Leave it to the algorithm. I give an example of the improvements here and why universities will die. If you go to university, even if you take a specific course, you're very likely to end up with a few guys your age, students, that share your interests, are the same age you are, and they'll be your best friends forever. But imagine that instead we look at all the students your age across the entire planet who are into the same topic, like you are a philosophy genius in Ireland, right? And suddenly you're connected with the other 9 leading out of the 10 philosophy genius of your generation. What couldn't the 10 of you do together, or when you're 25 in that case? This is what I'm looking at as a fantastic possibility for a new Hegelian revolution.
So just to pull this back to Nietzsche's Ubermensch and then maybe explore that idea, because that's a very interesting idea. When we're talking about Nietzsche's thesis, setting up that we're moving towards a character. Is a character is a vaguely centralized archetype which we can build a whole world around. And he's suggesting that this Ubermensch is something we must work into being by managing all these problems and directing us.
But that's why it's too Christian. It's not a work on your character. That's Jordan Peterson's mistake too. It's not a work on your character. Your character is the way it is. Don't worry about that. You will not change. Human beings never change. I'm very adamant about this in my work. I say that human beings have become more stupid over the last 10,000 years, but fortunately created smarter and smarter technologies over the last 10,000 years. So technology is going upwards and human beings are going downwards. And finally they come to a point where machines become more intelligent than human beings. We're very close to that. And then the question is, should we even be around, or should we just regard the machines as our children and then go off and die? Right? So that's where we're going to end up eventually, philosophically speaking. So we are not changing at all. It's not a work on your character. It's a work on accessibility to information. And number one, that means the amount of information available to you should be absolutely optimized. 2, you should have a really clever, fast, energetic algorithm that can find exactly what you want, exactly when you want it. For example, when you and I are recording this, there is no function yet in Google search that goes through audio material, so that any of the terms we use here, maybe for the first time ever, can be spotted here. But very soon you're going to have a search that says that, oh, there's a funny conversation between two weird guys from Ireland and Sweden, and they met on Zoom. You know, don't worry about that. But actually, at 41 minutes, 18 seconds into the conversation, for the first time ever, this term is used in human history. So you probably should go there etymologically to find out why the term is used. So that, and the footnote will be written hopefully somewhere. So the way we will access information will just get better and better and better. And the algorithms will get better. And if the big tech giants in California and China today try to manipulate these algorithms too much politically, or I mean, market-wise, commercially, or corrupt them politically because they're under political pressure, then the more the need will be to find new search engines and new social media forums and all the other things that we need these days, and to find these things outside of US and Chinese territory. That is, to me, the game 10 years going forward. I inspired and I was part in setting up the Pirate Party here in Scandinavia. You probably heard about them. And they were early pioneers, but we're eventually going to find out that what they did 20 years ago in the struggle for the free and open internet, and the army of hackers that they inspired. For example, all the Taiwanese hackers today, they're helping the kids in China access free information and fight against 3 million stupid Chinese censors, right? These are the kind of things that give me tons of inspiration. These are the new political struggles of the 21st century.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff, because these are... I think if you're to talk about procedural and adapting to your wave, like autonomy on the marketplace of ideas is just huge right now. Like you saw Jordan Peterson even throw his tantrum about Patreon is actually a good example. He's like, guys, you've gotten political. Like, you're not supposed to do that at all. But then it's not gotten any better. You know, it's keep descending that worse. But so this is interesting, because you've actually
this is why we're all interested in Jung. That's why guys like you are interested in Jung, because you're standing in front of a chaos that isn't ordered yet. We live in a sort of internet anarchy today. And the old guard are all bitching and complaining about it, calling it fake news and things, like if their news reports have been anything but fake. All news have always been fake. All news has always been presented in a way to kiss the ass of the power in place, right? So that's just ridiculous. No, but we need better organization. But the organization must not come from above. It must come from you and me directly in our interaction. And I like you and I trust you, and you trust me. That means we can share algorithms, and we can let our algorithms inspire each other. And that's eventually what's going to happen. And those algorithms are going to be incredibly powerful and nail exactly what we need when we need it. So the way we learn and absorb information is going to be efficient on a scale we've never seen before. Okay.
And so I guess, like, I'm finding it hard to tie this into the Ubermensch and all that. Maybe I should drop it. Like, maybe it's not the...
No, I think the Ubermensch will happen, but it'll be a technological advancement in connection to the human being, not an inner character development.
That's a very interesting idea. Maybe we could explore that. So you're like, bear in mind, you're talking to a lot of boyos looking for Jordan Peterson. So they're all probably like spazzing out right now, being like, what? My character can't change and all that. Like, could you explain that a bit more on what you mean and give us the honest take?
Why would your character change in the first place? You get laid and you look great and you're funny. What would you change? Into what? Every time I hear some California New Age person say they're interested in self-transformation, just like, what self are you now? What self are you going to be? And they can't even answer the question. I said, aren't you just being a pompous narcissist now, saying things that sound fancy, but you haven't really thought it through? I mean, my self changes radically all the time. I go through transformations all the time. I hopefully do new things in my life, and I meet new people. That changes me. It's not something I have to work on. I am a byproduct of the relations I engage in. But
it's a very interesting take, because if I was to speak, like, just from my experience, like, people have an awful problem where they don't think they're good enough. Like, it's a very global, it's a very, very common thing that I see in people, is that there's this immense shame. Like, there's even some artists I find that are brilliant, but they don't think they're good enough. They don't even like the stuff that they produce. And then that becomes a very, very interesting problem, because then they come to stuff like Jung and Jordan Peterson, they try to self-improve. And then you're coming out and you're suggesting that they don't need to. And I actually think there's good evidence to support what you're saying, is that, for example, if you think you're not creative enough, you'll notice that you dream every night. You're actually plenty creative enough. It's that you're almost in your own way is the real problem.
Yeah.
And that becomes quite fascinating. So
look at Jordan Peterson himself, ended up in a Russian drug addiction clinic, right? Poor Jordan. Poor Jordan. Love him and his family. But, you know, he's not a role model. He can't be called a role model.
That was actually Jimmy.
I can save him though. I can save him though, because if you think of him as a tantric teacher, then he's crazy wisdom. Yeah. So you should not follow his example, whatever you want to be. But maybe this working on yourself and working on your own character should just stop and be over with. Because if you need pills to help make that happen, maybe it's not even you any longer trying to do it. It's just a demon inside of you. Again, read Jung. Go back to Jung.
Jimmy, actually, the guy I do the channel with, he went through something similar where he was listening to Jordan Peterson and he got very, very stressed because it was like he had to work all day, every day to try make himself better. And then eventually, like he just said, in very laconic words here, he was just like, all right, fuck it. I'm just going to relax and do what feels a bit better and feels a bit more authentic and whatnot, and that will actually bring out more improvement. And that's genuinely like was a big move, like struggle for him and whatnot. And it's almost like he emotionally found what you're describing there. It's an interesting thought. I'll explore that more.
I think you have to start with not trying to change others, because this is reflexive. I mean, you are really thinking about yourself the way you think about other people. The values you project onto yourself are the values you project onto others. That's very Nietzsche. So you must not, what's hidden to you when you think about yourself is that you don't understand that you're projecting the same values onto others. So if you just decided, I'm not going to change anybody, I'll let just people be. They can come and ask me for advice. And if I have some advice, I will give it to them, but, you know, and give them my opinion, but I'll tell them that it's only my opinion. For God's sake, don't change because of me. Change because you want to change. Now, if you just decide not to change others, you don't have that urge to change yourself. So you can go on an exploratory journey, discovering who you are and accepting it. And that's it. Why do anything else? I think
I think you're right.
I think that's the kind of freedom Nietzsche ultimately is looking for. It's certainly where Jung and Freud were working. So it's psychoanalysis is essentially, you don't go to a psychologist who embraces you and takes you in and has empathy with you at all. You go to a psychoanalyst. That's like going to see an ice cold wall that only throws you back at yourself. You need to deal with your own shit, but you arrive at a complete and total self-acceptance, and that's where you're finished.
And is this is this sort of ideal, this technological Ubermensch, this idea that we build technology around us that actually takes away a lot of the bullshit that we put on top of ourselves and allows us to just be ourselves, allows us to just release our character and project our energy into the world? Like in some sense,
but we also create dishing machines and laundry machines and things that make us lazier because we have less work to do.
Yeah.
And more time to think and more time to be creative. And it creates a lot of junk on the internet, you know, like in Facebook and Instagram accounts full of bullshit. But, you know, that's just the price we probably have to pay for being in a new historical era when we work less.
So, like, to just propose a counter argument, or I'm not saying I have this figured out, but it actually fits into the conversation we were setting out to have, but we've had something different, I think, but it doesn't matter. This thesis that like we're good enough is actually quite a dangerous thing to just wield to a man, especially a young man, because I know, like when I was younger, I knew I wasn't good. I knew I had to do work. Like it wasn't that I wasn't muscular enough. I didn't know how to fight. And if I went out in reality saying my character's fine as it is, I would have got destroyed. And so there is a reality to it where I needed to build, I needed to create, I needed to go through arduous discipline stress. I needed to shame myself and say, I'm pathetic. I'm not up to scratch yet. And that actually did help me in some sense. That did build myself up. And that would actually very conveniently relate to what I understood as the sort of counter take on Nietzsche, in that this idea that we're going to technologically fix ourselves. I know you're not necessarily saying that, but allow me to straw man slightly.
Yeah.
We're going to technologically create the Iron Man and then fix all our biological problems. There's another strain of thought that's very much suppressed or just not talked about that much anymore, that we could actually like physically focus on building ourselves as a group and say, all right, well, we all get together in a cultural thing and impose a sort of discipline that like we're all going to stay extremely healthy, and we're going to then for that reason have extremely fertile bodies and then keep that upward spiral and
unless
grow
we
ourselves.
create enough biological weapons to just destroy that.
Oh, yes, true. Yeah, that's
we're
true.
humans, right?
Yes,
No, I would say I'm a Zoroastrian, right? So of all the great Eastern religions, when I studied them, I decided not to go for Buddhism or Taoism, but go for the third one, which is Zoroastrianism, which is more hardcore. But it has an intentional ethics and intentional ethics only. But it's intentional in a double way that Hegel would have loved. It means that you're never responsible for the outcomes of your actions. And if you would be responsible for the outcome of your actions, you'd be pagan, right? Even Christianity doesn't believe that. So you're responsible for your intentions.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that's even in the court of law these days. We hopefully judge people according to their intentions and not according to the outcome of your actions, because the outcome of your actions are something you have very little to do with.
Very interesting.
Yeah. If you look at okay, I'll give you a perfect example today. If you found the Chinese guy who had a crappy lunch somewhere in Wuhan, China in October last year and ate a bat, and that resulted in millions of people dying, would you pull him through the street like a scapegoat and kill him? Or would you just say, that was a crappy lunch, wasn't it? And kiss him? What? You'd have to do either of the two. The Zoroastrian would clearly kiss his head and said, oh God. And then probably the Chinese guy would say, well, what shouldn't have done? You should have known better. But next time, don't eat the bat. Okay, can we just stop the bat eating? Okay, so the Zoroastrian will say, you learn from your mistakes and you must not repeat the mistakes. And that's all you do in Zoroastrian ethics, because the only thing you can do, because you are not responsible for the outcome of your actions, because your part in the outcome of your actions is still so small that the outcome involves so many other things. And also the funny thing, once you allow people to judge according to the outcome of the actions, they tend to take outcomes years later to be your responsibility. And then it gets, of course, even more absurd. It's like, if you want to have a baby, you can have a child, and 50% of the genes are yours. But 4 generations later, nature has fooled you. It's only going to be like a 16th in a baby of your genes, and the rest is just going to be other people. And nobody's ever going to see any remote similarity to you any longer. So that's how nature fools us in our vanity, into our narcissism, by looking at things too closely. We think we're also dead important what we do. It's precisely by looking at the long-term effects of our behavior that we see that we collectively can have an effect on the world, but not individually. So this means, for me, ethics is all about the intention. And that's where the answer comes into the picture. Okay, you're only as good as you are when you address your intentions and make your decision. Now, if you've trained and you're fit, and if you trained and studied so you know more, then you can make better informed decisions. You will also be held responsible more, because your intentions should be better in that case. But at the end of the day, it's what you do with that experience and how you learn from your mistakes and not repeat them that is going to create a civilization. Yeah, that is Zoroastrianism in its core, right? So that's how Zoroastrians moved away from paganism. The Christians tried to kill a scapegoat on the cross and then thought they were over it. And then they went for pogroms and killed Jews and didn't make much of a difference. I don't think you symbolically can change the world. The Zoroastrians consciously changed it. Right?
Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting take as well. You can't symbolically change the world, because I guess there's a lot of people in my sphere, and these ideas you're putting on me, like this is something I neglected. Is I guess this is interesting. Like, how should I frame you? Because you seem to have a sort of are you like a progressive philosopher or something like that? Like, how should I frame that? Because you've got a lot of ideas that would be like the antithesis to some of the things I'm talking about, or at least some of the things in my sphere I'm talking about. And so it's very interesting to play around with them. Like
I'm very much a Hegelian in the sense that I want to be a response to the stupidity of the age I live in. And right now we're lacking the phallic. So we're lacking phallic energy in society. And that's obviously because with Hitler and Stalin and colonialism and the atomic bomb all exploding in our faces in 1945, we realized that the guys had done a bad job. And the women were out of the workforce, and they took responsibility, and they shared at least half for everything we produce. And because they've always shared half the responsibility, that's called feminism. We get androgenism. Androgenism is like the LGBT movement and all that. I can't remember how many letters they have these days. I just call them androgynous. But these are people who are in between men and women, and that's exactly how they become adults, being both. they got their roles in society clarified and all that. But we're now at a stage where the matrical, which is so the feminine without the masculine, dominates culture on such a level that we've gone into an state in an age of mass infantility. And the internet has endorsed this during its first 30 years. And social justice warriors, of course, are an example of this. I'm aggressively against Rousseau and the lynch mobs out there. I think the lynch mobs are terrible. I think they should have been gone by now in civilization. Hopefully we can get rid of them by exposing them and exposing how rotten they are to the core in their ideology. So the hyper-narcissism and the infantility that I see society today is because there's a lack of phallic direction. Now, technology has a response to that. It has a phallus of writing, that's the algorithm. The question is, can we step up as human beings and be more of leaders? Mm-hmm. And I think helping and guiding people to sort out the mess, being priests, is what we need first. Okay. Then eventually we need proper leaders, proper chieftains or kings too that can guide us forward. But I think the phallic is what's lacking. That's why working with men and to fix men is a major concern for me. I'm involved with the European men's movement, and we have a new sort of post-feminist European women's movement as well, which is fantastic. But I'm not involved with that. I'm involved with the men's movement. And I think fixing and making men being responsible for themselves is where I tie in with Jordan Peterson's work. And we see a lot of interest in Jung and Nietzsche among these guys. Mm-hmm. But my response to Jordan is that the work on your character should be rather Aristotelian, like work on your environment as much as you work on your character, at least. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do you spend your time on every day? Those things are more into what influences you is just as interesting as what is going on inside of you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. This is a lovely conclusion. I think I'll wrap it up there. I think I'll say thank you for your time. I had plenty of very, very novel ideas came up in that I'm going to juggle around with and see what I come up with. In the meantime, try not to become an Ubermensch too soon. Leave us all behind if you could. And if all the boyos are out there, I recommend you check out Alexander on Alexander Bard. I guess just smash the Google algorithm and check it out. There's a litany of stuff up there. He has several books. I believe one of them was Digital Libido and the other one is God in an Internet Age. So you can check those out.
We're writing a trilogy at the moment. The first one is called Synthism, Creating God in the Internet Age.
Ah, yes.
And it's about technology being the God of our age. And then this second one is called Digital Libido, Sex, Power, and Violence in the Network Society. So it's a kind of dark, very Jungian view of the world for the next 30 to 50 years. But the third one is going to be an overall grand narrative, like all the narratives of humanity combined to understand what narrative is in a fundamental way, pointing forward. So then we finish off the trilogy. That's the one we're working on now and for the next 2 years or so. So that's what I'm at.
Fantastic, sir. And Boyo redacted alert. Keep an eye out for that stuff, and we will talk to you all later. Alexander, thank you very much.
Yes, big love to you and everybody else.
Bye. Talk to you later, chance.
Yeah, there we go.